Okay, so this is the Is Your Novel Editor Ready webinar with myself, Claire Cronshaw, and with Andy Hodges as well. So here we are.
Okay. So just one point, first of all, can everybody see the slides as the main picture that you can see? If not, send a message in the chat and we'll sort that out. And if at any time there's any technical clarifications you want to make, feel free to drop a message in the chat as well. All right. So we'll start with a very quick introduction. Claire, do you want to go first?
Yep, thank you, Andy. So I'm Claire Cronshaw and I am a line and copy editor and I work with indie authors. My main three genres that I work with are fantasy, romance and women's fiction. And I've been doing this for 5, 6 years now. I work full time. And yeah, line and copy edits. I also do manuscript assessments, and more recently, I have begun offering coaching and author talks and things of that nature. I used to be an English teacher. I was an English teacher for 18 years. My academic background is in English literature. My BA was in English literature and educational studies. And that's me. So over to Andy to tell you about himself.
Okay, yep. I'll just introduce myself briefly as well. So my name's Andrew Hodges, and the thing I'm most passionate about of all is developmental editing. So that's my favorite phase. If you don't know what that is, I'll be discussing it briefly later on. And I work on young adult and adult fiction. My main genres are science fiction and fantasy. I do some literary fiction and romance as well. And I'm also interested in horror, but I don't get to edit that so often. I do a mixture of work for traditional publishers. So I copy edit and proofread for Penguin Random House USA. And I also work with either self-publishing authors or authors who are about to query a novel. So they're looking for a literary agent and they often need more developmental work rather than, say, a copy edit. I've been doing this full time for over 5 years now and part time for nearly 10 years, which is a long time. And before I did this, I worked as a cultural anthropologist. I'm a published researcher. I published cultural anthropology books, and that's why I'm interested in culture, world building, and setting, especially. And that's what attracted me to science fiction and fantasy, especially. Okay, so we'll now move on to the next slide. So this is a very quick introduction, first of all, to the webinar. So first of all, I'll take you through the publishing process and I'll flag how that might be different if you're self-publishing compared with traditional forms of publishing. Although we won't have time to get into the nitty-gritty details of all of that because these days there are so many different ways of publishing a book. I'll then talk about where new authors often come unstuck. And after that, I'll give you an example and I'll be talking about perspective and point of view. Don't worry if you've never heard of that. Quite a few authors haven't, and I'll be taking you through that. And then it'll be over to Claire, who will be discussing dialogue. And then she'll briefly take you through, is your novel editor ready? Kind of things to look out for. And then at the very end, for about 5 minutes, we'll tell you about our storytelling for science fiction and fantasy writers course. So then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So the publishing process, first of all. Next slide. Okay. So all book ideas, whether fiction or non-fiction, start with a concept. That concept might be quite simple or it could be quite complicated. So here's one example of a book concept. A self-made millionaire in 1920s, East Coast USA, pursues a young woman whom he loved in his youth. Okay, you might know what that is. It's A Great Gatsby. So that's one example of a story concept, and it's kind of a summary of what the story is about and how it's different to other stories. And that can get especially interesting for science fiction and fantasy, just because the story concept often involves introducing new world building details, such as what if the ground was poisonous at night, for example. Now, you can have 100 great story concepts, but that doesn't mean that you have a great novel or a novel at all at that point. So the next stage after that is the planning stage. And fiction writers tend to either lean on the side of doing lots of planning or not doing very much at all. And that's often referred to as plotting versus pantsing. I know for myself, my process is intuitive at the start. And when I wrote my first novel draft, I write as well, I pantsed it. And what happened to me is that I gave up halfway through, had a big pause, came back to it later on. But if you completely discovery write or pants, what can happen is that you lose momentum halfway through in that way. At the other extreme, you have people who plot a novel in detail, scene by scene before they write anything. I think there's something called the snowflake method, which you might have heard of, where you really start with something very short, like a story concept, and then expand it out into scenes, and then you go into more and more detail. Plotting can be great, but it can also be a distraction from writing itself. And it's a different kind of writing to creative writing. It's actually more writing a synopsis or a summary is more like nonfiction writing. People who plot often have story Bibles. And again, if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, I highly recommend these. So a story Bible is whatever you want it to be, but really detailed notes on the story world. So for a fantasy novel, it would be detailed world building notes on points that are relevant to the world and the story there. Like maybe there are 2 suns or 5 moons, for example. If you're writing a romance novel, lots of the details in that story Bible would be much more internal. So you'd be looking at details of the protagonist's relationship history, for instance. Any kind of incidents that happen to them in their childhood or early adulthood that have had an impact on them in a big way. So making those kind of notes, again, that can be really useful. This is at the planning stage, but it can also be a distraction for some people from sitting down and writing the story. Next comes the first draft. Now, this is a very big milestone. Only 3% of people who start writing a book ever get this far. However, the first draft is almost always very rough and unfinished, even if you think it's not. So one author who I spoke with used the phrase vomit draft, and I really like that because it gives you permission just to get everything out on page without worrying too much about everything being perfect at the first draft stage. And as an editor, what I'll add here is it's much easier to edit a bad draft than to write something new from scratch. So the advice that I would give for the first draft stage is just write. Don't think too much about everything being perfect or character inconsistencies and things like that. You can work on that at the development stage. So the next stage is development, and this might be where you bring in professional editorial help, a developmental editor. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Generally, when you're developing your story, you want to go from big to small. So you'll be starting with the big issues with the story. That might be character arcs, pacing, things like that. And once you've got all of that sorted, then you'll start to focus on the more sentence level stuff. Now, at the development stage, you can actually source a lot of help from your network. And this is one of the things I shout about a lot is build a network as an author. Find people who you can do a critique swap with, who will give you feedback in exchange for their feedback, for instance. If you can find beta readers, they're people who will read through your story draft and give you feedback. Craft books can also be incredibly helpful at this stage. And some authors will work with a professional editor or a book coach at this stage. They might just want feedback on a chapter or two, or they might just want to talk about the story because they're feeling overwhelmed by it. Once you're happy that all the parts of the story are in the right place, then you'll have the final draft. So, and when you have this kind of final version, it's not the version that will be published, but it's the version that you'll send to a copy or line editor, somebody like Claire. And they will basically polish the prose. And that might be a heavy polish. It might be refining style, sharpening voice, removing redundant sentences, or even deleting whole sentences or paragraphs to improve the pacing. At the other end of the scale, it really could just be making sure the commas are used correctly and everything's in the correct order in the right place. Okay, next slide. Okay, so after copy editing and I've lost my voice here. After copy editing and line editing, then it'll go to layout and design. And then there'll be proofreading and publication after that. So at the layout stage, in traditional publishing, that's when the book will be formatted. So it'll have it'll look like it will when it's printed at the very end. If you're self-publishing, many people will do this individually. They might do it themselves, or they might hire a book formatter. And Claire will be able to tell you a little bit more about that. And then finally, you have the proofreading phase. So in traditional publishing, that's done on a PDF version of where everything's laid out. And that's really just about looking for any remaining mistakes. That's really about quality assessment, checking for quality assessment, rather than making any kind of stylistic or substantive changes to the text. And then the fun really begins, because then you publish the book, which can often be a bit of an anticlimax. And then you'll probably be involved in marketing the book in some way. And if you're published traditionally, then you can expect more help from the publisher with that. If you're self-publishing, then it's really down to you. Okay. So, next slide. Where do authors often come unstuck? Overwhelmingly, it's at the first draft stage. And there's several reasons for this. Next slide. Okay. And the main one is that when people write the first draft, it feels like a massive, massive achievement. And as I said before, only 3% of people make it that far. So they feel, yes, I'm an author now. I have a book. I want to put it out there in the world. And not everybody realizes that that's really just the beginning, and that first drafts almost always need that heavy editing and changes being made. Maybe more, maybe less, depending on where you are at the plotting and the pantsing on that spectrum. But the first draft is very rarely in like high quality publishable condition. And I call this beginner's hubris, because it's that feeling like once you've written, I don't know, 3 or 4 books, you probably got used to the idea that the first draft is just the beginning and you're going to have to do more work after that. Another reason why authors often come unstuck in this stage is they have kind of a be strong message in their personality. And that's kind of, this is more common among men authors. I will do this myself. I will handle it. I know what I'm doing. I don't need help. I tried a beta reader, it didn't work out for me, that kind of thing. So watch out for that kind of message too. And I experienced that when I first wrote a novel. I remember writing several chapters, being pretty unaware of the whole process of querying, but I was like, oh, I've written a few chapters. I will contact some publishers, some literary agents. And I did that, and I got some rejections, obviously. And I can laugh about it now, but it is quite a common thing that especially, but not always men authors do. Another issue here can be the lack of craft knowledge, and we'll discuss that in the second half of this webinar. And then, as I've mentioned before, just not having a network with other writers, not knowing what the next stages could be. Sometimes having a network can also be a problem because you can get unhelpful critique feedback. That would be a whole separate webinar. But oftentimes critique feedback is somewhat subjective, and it can be difficult to untangle good feedback from highly subjective or even, I don't know, bad faith feedback. So be careful about who you send your manuscript out for critique feedback from, and kind of navigate that whole process carefully. I know a few editors who run groups where they offer kind of critique swaps and they manage the process, and I think that can be helpful, for example. And then oftentimes there's just simply a lack of knowledge about the editing process, about what copy editing or line editing, this heavy copy editing involves. And that often links to the lack of craft knowledge. I think it's very common. I've experienced this quite a lot, that people will contact me looking for, typos to be corrected. They're scared of incorrect spellings going out to their audience and so on. And then when you look at the manuscript, there's other issues that trained fiction editors will look out for, such as showing and telling, perspective issues, and so on. So I'm now going to briefly talk about perspective, just to give you a flavor. Okay. So you may have heard these words, point of view and perspective. So point of view is kind of the type of narrator. Is it I? Is it you? Is it he, she, they? So here, for instance, we've got a first person story. I woke up exhausted. Those stupid neighbors partying on a weeknight again. Okay, and that's the most immersive, really. Then you've got a second person point of view. And this is very rarely used in novel length fiction because it's really kind of intrusive, saying you woke up exhausted, your neighbors had been partying on a weeknight again, and you were sick of it. And then you've got third person. Ollie woke up exhausted. His neighbors had been partying on a weeknight again, and he was pissed off. So in these three sentences, really, it's just the pronouns that have changed, but point of view is much more than that. If we just take first person, for example, there are two different kinds of first person narration. You can have one which is in the moment, like the actions unfolding, or you can have another, which is like a memoir where a person's looking back on something in the past. So that's just the first person. And third person is more complicated than that. There are more issues to look out for. So in my experience, authors often, but not always, they will pick a point of view subconsciously. They will think about books they've read that they've enjoyed, and they will copy bits of the style. So, for instance, I write young adult fiction. First person points of view are very common in there. So intuitively, that was what I was drawn to, and that's how I started writing. A developmental editor, meanwhile, will look out for problems at sentence level that can arise. And I'll give you one example on the next slide. So what we've got here is a third person narration. So it's close, so we're kind of following the characters closely. It's not distance. It's not like a godlike person outside the story looking at what's happening in the story world. So I'll read it out. So Enos entered the spaceship and glanced at Bob, who was wearing the ring she had bought him. Bob followed Enos to the hydroponics bay, and as Enos arrived, nostalgia and excitement washed over him. "Hi, Billy," Enos said. Billy smiled and returned the greeting. He was jealous of Enos's relationship with Bob and could see her gazing at Bob's ring. Bob looked over at Enos and was excited to see her again. He hated Billy and wished he'd just leave the spaceship. He imagined a escape pod being accidentally activated, simply sucking Billy into space. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I started to get bored, first of all. as I read through that, because it's very told. So it's this person did this person did that. But from a point of view and perspective angle, I was going to say perspective twice there, but that doesn't really work. What's happening here, and it's a problem, is that the kind of who we are following keeps changing. So at first we're following Enos closely. So imagine that the camera's kind of closely following Enos around, and she spots Bob. And then we see there's some action. And then we're following Bob closely, and not just closely. It's not just a camera that's on him, but we're feeling his feelings, excitement, and nostalgia, and so on. Then Billy's mentioned. We've got some action there, but then we hop into kind of Billy's perspective. So Billy was jealous of Venus's relationship with Bob. So we've jumped, it's called head hopping 3 times here. And it can really, really confuse the reader. And it's often a problem for storytelling just because it's hard for the reader to get attached to a particular character if they keep jumping around like this and they're not sure of who the focus is on. So, for instance, when you're doing a line edit or a developmental edit, one of the things you might be looking for is to make sure that there's just a focus on one person per chapter and that the book doesn't jump around even at chapter level between like 5 or 6 or more different people. Okay. So that's perspective and POV, and that's just one of the issues that can come up that a good fiction editor will train you to look out for. And a good edit from a fiction editor is really also a lesson in writing craft. All right, that's me. So
Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, so we'll move on to my section of the presentation now. So what I'm going to look at now is dialogue. And again, like Andy's example there, the point we are going for here is to show you what not to do really, and to be able to spot the problems. And I'm going to read through this example to you here, and I'd like you to look out for dodgy dialogue. But I don't mean punctuation. You know, dialogue punctuation can be tricky. But dialogue punctuation is something that you can, you can learn that fairly easily. You just need to sit down and put some time aside and figure it out. But actually writing successful dialogue is about far more than making sure the commas are in the right place. And we're going to have a look today at this dialogue and what's wrong with it. And I can tell you that we're not looking at the punctuation here. We're looking more at the content of what's said and what's written and how it's written. So here we go. Max eyed the magical rift that had appeared in the alley. Boss, he said, an early return. I expected you after the Wizard Council meeting. Yeah, Chief Mage turned aside, back early. Disturbing news from the magical underworld. The magical underworld that's rife with rogue sorcerers and mystical gangs? Indeed, Turner gestured. Your only sister, Anna, has disappeared. Do you suspect foul play? Max gulped. Yes, Turner said, that is certain. That's crazy, Max exclaimed. If she is turned the way of the darkness, Turner said, gaze fixed, she could unleash chaos. We need to intervene, and I believe you're the one. Max looked shocked. Me? I'm not but a humble delivery guy. A delivery guy you may be, but you are attuned to ancient magic. Gotcha, Max declared. I'm in. First of all, apologies about the cheesy reading voice. Okay. There was something off about that, wasn't there? And it wasn't just my dodgy reading. Just have a look, like glance your eye down here. Max eyed the magical rift that had appeared in the alley. Boss, an early return. I expected you after the Wizard Council meeting. Yeah, back early. Disturbing news from magical underworld. The magical underworld that's rife with rogue sorcerers and mystical gangs. I mean, it's a bit on the nose, isn't it? It's a bit on the nose. Do you suspect foul sorry, your only sister Anna has disappeared. Do you suspect foul play? So what we're dealing with here is I want to look at three different issues essentially. I want to look at the word choice. I want to look at something called shared knowledge, and I will mention structure. Anyway, we'll start with the word choice, which I've highlighted. Certain words here I've highlighted in yellow because I want to pay attention to them. So we've got Max, and Max is the one down here who is the delivery guy, and then we've got Chief Mage Turner. So Chief Mage Turner uses yeah at this point here. And later on, he talks about, this is him, if she's turned the way of the darkness, unleash chaos. And then you've got Max, and Max saying things like, do you suspect foul play? But then crazy, and I'm not but a humble delivery guy. And then at the end here, I should have made this yellow, gotcha. Okay. Um, there's something going on with the register of that dialogue, the formality. How have we got characters who are at one point speaking in a very modern, contemporary sort of gotcha, yeah, that's crazy kind of way, that the more informal end of the formality spectrum, and then suspect foul play and unleash chaos and naught but a humble delivery guy. There's something going wrong there with the language. So obviously when you are creating your characters, when you are creating your worlds and you're think about who occupies them, you really need to picture these characters, and you need to make sure that these characters have got a very particular way of speaking, and that way of speaking just works and suits and doesn't drift in and out. And it's this seems, I've given some really on the nose examples here. Like I very much doubt that anybody attending this webinar is going to be using these types of words side by side, but I have just gone a little bit exaggerated here just to demonstrate that there is this sort of register. We have got our own ways of speaking, and you need to make sure that the character words very much suit their who they're meant to be. So the delivery guy Max, maybe we're okay with delivery guy Max saying that's crazy and gotcha. But if Turner is a Chief Mage Turner, then perhaps that more elevated register would suit him. So make sure he's not drifting in and out of a formal to informal register. So making sure that your word choice suits the formality and the character and the context there. What I do enjoy about this extract, and I'm enjoying it because it's terrible, is how ham-fisted what I'm calling shared knowledge has been, how that's been dealt with, how poorly it's been dealt with. So you have here Chief Mage Turner has arrived, and he's arrived back earlier than Max was expecting. So Chief Mage Turner confirms that he's back early, and there's disturbing news from the magical underworld. Now this is what I enjoy, and I'm only enjoying it because it's terrible. The magical underworld that's rife with rogue sorcerers and mystical gangs. Indeed. So, I mean, they could be being funny with each other. That could just be a little bit of an in joke there, and Max is trying to maybe get under Chief Mage Turner's skin. But the problem that I'm seeing here is that this is essentially info dump for the reader's benefit, so that the reader can learn that the magical underworld is rife with rogue sorcerers and mystical gangs. There needs to be a more subtle and sophisticated way of sharing that information with the readers, because what we would assume is that Chief Mage Turner and Max both know that, and they don't need to confirm that with one another. They both know what they're talking about. Simply the mention of the magical underworld should be enough for Max to know that what he's talking about, the underworld that's rife with rogue sorcerers. Like that should be enough of a clue as to what he's referring to. That could be dealt with some other way in the novel, but it's not being dealt with well here in this dialogue. Okay. Another example of that is here, where indeed he confirms, he has been in the magical underworld. Disturbing news from magical underworld. Indeed, your only sister Anna has disappeared. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but Max will be aware of his sister's name. So he does not need to hear his own sister's name being confirmed to him. Turner he only needed to say your only sister, Anna's disappeared or your sister's disappeared. We've got too much going on here. It's not just sister, it's not just Anna, it's your only sister Anna. Again, that's kind of info dumping, telling the reader something that you want the reader to know, but not dealing with it in a subtle way. And what you have to remember is that your reader's intelligent, and if that could be dealt with, for instance, through the way that Max reacts to hearing Anna's disappeared. I mean, he's gulping, so we know there that he's gulping. So obviously there's something about Anna. Anna matters to him. He's worried about Anna, and I'm sure there's some other way in the narrative that we can find out or realize that we're talking about his sister. So that's what I'm referring to as shared knowledge. Like, who knows what within the world of the story? What do the readers know? What do the readers need to be to be told? And how can you handle that in a way that is, more subtle than what you can see in front of you? In terms of structure here, I mean, if you just visually look down the slide, everything's quite samey, really. So if you look, for instance, at, how we have the dialogue followed by the action beat, the dialogue and then an action beat. Okay, here it's been switched. There's an action beat and then there's some dialogue, but it's quite formulaic, and there isn't much variation there, I would say, as you look down the page. And that would be something that could be dealt with as well. So we're making sure that your novel is editor ready, looking at the dialogue, looking at the word choice, looking at the shared knowledge, looking at the structure is an important step before you send your work off to an editor. I want to say some more about structure here with this slide. I know there's lots of blur there. It's for a reason. Right, I'll have a little read of what you can see there. Different scenario entirely. So, would you like a cup of tea? Bronwyn asked. The hooded figure chuckled. Oh, yes, please. I love tea. Tea's the best. Blah, 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 blah. This here is the hooded figure holding court for this many lines. Oh yes, please, I love tea, tea's the best. And then it's blurred out, but this could be, I don't know, the hooded figure talking about her favorite types of tea and why tea's the best, and going into an anecdote about a time when tea was important to her. Just general tea content. But that's a lot. That's a lot. That's too much. And then you go back to Bronwyn here, and Bronwyn simply asks, milk and sugar? Question mark. Now, again, it could be done for humorous effect, but the reason I'm showing you this, and again, it is a bit of an exaggerated example and it is a bit on the nose, is about thinking about how long characters are speaking for. Your readers will get bored. I mean, you could make the point that the hooded figure is a bit of a windbag by having, I don't know, 3 or 4 lines, 5 lines of dialogue, something like this. But whatever this ends up being, 15, 16, I don't know how many lines that was, but that is excessive. You don't need this much to tell readers that a character is a windbag. So be careful of that, because I have seen this in manuscripts where you just think, there's no way this is natural, and this is actually uncomfortable to read, and I'm getting bored, and like I get the gist, like I could get the gist already after far fewer lines of dialogue than that. Okay, so making sure that dialogue is right before you get your manuscript ready to send to an editor is an important step. Okay, and to summarize that then, for your dialogue, for your in-world dialogue, so the dialogue that happens within the story, think about your word choices. Choose words carefully for your characters and their emotions, the time and the place, the relationships, context. The shared knowledge there, for instance, about the sister Anna, decide what to reveal and what to leave unsaid. And then for structure, understand turn taking and flaw holding, and who speaks when and how much is too much and how much is about right. But I would also like you to think about dialogue that is, sorry, 1 second, there's somebody in the chat. Oh, sorry, excuse me. I also want you to think about the fact that dialogue is that the novel itself is a dialogue with the reader. You're speaking to the reader, so judge the right amount to say and keep the dialogue pertinent. And it's important to craft dialogue and not a transcript. So what we mean by that is that in regular speech, you might have an opening sequence. Hello, how are you? How's your day? That kind of thing. Whereas that's too much clutter in a novel. And so you want to keep your dialogue pertinent. Okay. Now, we would briefly like to tell you about our upcoming course that launches on the 29th of January. That's a Monday. And this course is storytelling for SFF writers. I don't know about the participants who are with us today and how many of you are science fiction and fantasy writers and how many of you are not. It'd be worthwhile taking a little look at our course, regardless of whether you're SFF or you're not, because we're teaching the fundamentals of storytelling. Let me have a little take you to that website so you can have a little look at it. Hopefully now you can see the website. I'll scroll back up to the top. So this is storytelling for science fiction and fantasy writers. As I said, starts January the 29th. And you will learn how to spot storytelling problems. Now, we've outlined 2 storytelling problems in today's webinar. We've looked at POV and perspective, and we've looked at dialogue. So our course is for people who want to query a novel with a literary agent, or who want to self-publish, or just improve your writing craft and make sure you feel confident before you hire an editor. Now, this course, it's 4 weeks of course materials, weekly check-ins with us, and there is an assignment at the end of it that you will get detailed tutor feedback based on that assignment, and you can also have a 30-minute chat with either Andy or me. So there's more detail on the website there about us too, and then it talks you through what the course actually consists of. And week 1, you get the introduction and you get this unit here about showing and telling. So each Monday, a new set of materials will be released. So this is week 1, where you learn the intro and showing and telling. Week 2, you'll get point of view. Week 3, a unit on dialogue. So point of view and dialogue, we've touched on today, but obviously a lot more depth in the course itself. And the final week, world building and a final assignment too. Okay, so we'll go back to here now. So if anyone's got any questions about that, please just let us know. And so we're drawing to the end of the webinar now, and the recorded section of the webinar, and I just want to summarize really 4 key elements of making sure that your novel is editor ready. So there are really 4 key elements of storytelling: showing and telling, point of view, dialogue, and world building. And those things should be right, or as good as you can get them under your own steam, before you submit to a literary agent or to an editor. So it's about being evaluative and assessing how confident you feel about your ability to show and tell, and all those 4 skills there. And if you feel like you are in the green end of this spectrum, then great. Then you are ready to submit your novel to an editor. Now, you don't want to waste your money. You don't want to send your manuscript off to an editor before it's right, because nobody wants that. So being clear on making sure that you have done you have got these as good as you can under your own steam first beforehand is what you need to do.
Can I
Andy?
say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to say, so obviously there's other things that are really important to work on, like characterization, character arcs, plots and pacing, setting and things like that. But we picked these because these are really foundational things that we've repeatedly come across as editors. So if there was a top 10 of issues that constantly come
Yeah,
up, these four would be definitely in the top 5. So that's the
absolutely.
rationale there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so these aren't everything, but these are the things that we have. If I've ever had to look at a manuscript and think and say to the author, I'm really sorry, but this isn't actually ready for an edit yet. The reason it's not been ready for an edit has been one or more of these things. The 10 characterization and so on seem to come a lot more naturally to writers, but it's these for issues that sometimes have had issues with. Okay, so thank you for listening to the presentation part of this webinar. If you are interested in signing up for the course, the link is there and it'll be sent out in the follow-up email too. And if you're not interested in the course but you want to keep in contact with us, then you've got our details here. So Andy's on info@thenarrativecraft.com and I'm contact@cherryedits.com. Now, if you're happy to stick around, we are going to stop recording now and turn over to the Q&A section of the webinar. So I'll just stop record. So thank you, everybody,
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
and bye-bye. So stop recording.